Hello and welcome. My name is Anna Sophia Lahovry, and I'm a member of the Dole Institute's Student Advisory Board, the official student group of the Institute. The Student Advisory Board is a bipartisan group whose members have access to exciting opportunities through their involvement with the Institute. This includes volunteering for evening programs and networking with our special guests. If you are a student and would like to join, please contact us by emailing dolesab@ku.edu. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics, and thank you for attending today's program, presented by the Department of Military History at the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. After the program, we will have some time for the audience to ask questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and a student worker with a microphone will come to you. Please stand if you are able, and just ask one brief question. The Dole Institute's mission is to foster civil and respectful discussion around important and often difficult topics. Please phrase your questions with this in mind. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. And now, please join me in welcoming the Director of the Department of Military History, Dr. Cotter.
Thanks very much. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. It's great to see a very large crowd here today. I'm very glad you could all make it out today. Today we're in for a treat, and it's a little different. It is history, but it's far more recent than where we usually dabble. We're going to hear today from Dirk Ringgenberg, and Dirk is a member of the Department of Military History, and is he's one of the department's instructors. And he's a retired military officer, retired in 2011, spent his career as an infantryman, and is going to talk to us today about his time as the S3 Air in the 2nd of the 503rd. I got that right? Okay. Dirk's a combat veteran. He served 2 tours in Iraq, one with the 173rd that he's going to talk about today, a subsequent one with the 82nd, and he had a second tour in Afghanistan with the 173rd. Dirk's a holder of a Silver Star, and he's finishing up his dissertation at the University of Iowa, and he's writing about communications challenges in the First World War. Well, adequate?
Absolutely.
I appreciate that. So today, ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Mr. Dirk Ringgenberg.
Thank you, sir, and thank you to the Dole Institute. It is truly an honor to be up here on the stage and following in the footsteps of many of my esteemed colleagues who are here in the audience today and are watching at home. It is truly an honor. And I also would like to thank my son who foregone his afternoon classes at Lansing High School to be here today. Thanks, Hunter. Yeah, there you go. I deserve a round of applause. A near and dear topic to my heart, and one that obviously elicits a lot of opinions one way or another. The invasion of Iraq. We're going to be talking about a small portion of that, the northern portion, and I'm going to use some of my personal experiences as a member of a staff in one of the infantry battalions in the 173rd to try to kind of paint that picture and show a little bit of behind the scenes of what it takes when things start happening very dynamically as we moved along towards the invasion. Initially, as many of you know, the actions that were going to be happening in the north, certainly with the 4th Infantry Division that we'll talk about a little bit more in detail, did not happen, and many things changed out of that. As I talk about the lead up to the operation, I'm going to really kind of cover what impact that had on the 173rd and those soft units that then took over the north, and how all of that intertwined. And to include armor formations that came out of the 1st Infantry Division that supplemented the 173rd to make a more robust package. I'm going to explain a little bit about what an actual operations officer in an infantry battalion, an assistant operations officer, which is what I was, for the air portion, what that kind of entails and some of the problem sets that we were dealing with. And then, of course, we're going to go through the sequence of the jump into northern Iraq and the airland that followed. And then at the end, I'm going to explain a few little items that I brought up here that kind of weave into that story as we go through it. So the Operation Northern Delay really got its grassroots in a 90s operation called Operation Pilgrim, which was, in its essence, a heavy division if, in fact, we had to go into Iraq, coming from the north. So this plan was on the books for many years. When the buildup started happening in 2002, fall of 2002 and early 2003, this was the direction that was going to happen. The 4th Infantry Division, which was the new division with all of its modularity stuff, was coming in through the north, and the 173rd Airborne Brigade out of Vicenza, Italy, northern Italy is where we were based, was going to provide support to the 4th Infantry Division. On about 2 March 2003, all of that changed. Turkey voted not to allow ground forces to come in through the north. This single act, with forces already in the Mediterranean, changed essentially the major portions of what were going to happen in the north. The major concern for the invasion was, how do we tie down Iraqi forces that are in the north and prevent them from repositioning to the south? Now, once Turkey announced that they weren't going to allow any forces to come in, Iraq did reposition one of the Republican Guard divisions from Mosul down towards Tikrit. And that kind of stopped at that point. What I have demonstrated here on the left is kind of the deception and soft, the Special Operations Forces operations that commenced to, number one, keep any other Iraqi formations from moving and repositioning towards where the main attack, which was coming out of Kuwait, was going to happen. Lots of actions were taking place. Up in the far north, you see where it says the green line. This was an area of semi-autonomous Iraq controlled by the Kurdish forces, really the Peshmerga, who were already working with U.S. agencies to kind of pin down and kind of hold ground against some of the Iraqi forces that were in Mosul down towards Kirkuk up in the north. But they were going to need, a bigger portion of combat power if they were really going to pull that off once things started happening. On about 4 March, United States Army Europe assigned the 173rd Airborne Brigade to Special Operations Command to use in northern Iraq. Now, this was the first time that a conventional brigade-size organization was going to be task organized underneath a special operations organization from the 10th Special Forces Group. Task Force Viking was that organization that was then going to go into northern Iraq and tie down and destroy those Iraqi forces that remained along the green line. Again, the main purpose was to tie down Iraqi forces, but also in the event of a catastrophic regime collapse, which was a very distinct possibility based off of years of sanctions and information coming out of Iraq, was to have a credible force in the north that could prevent a lot of sectarian strife, prevent Turkey from coming in and claiming a chunk of Iraq, or any myriad of things that could happen. So USARA looked, the Combined Forces Land Component Command looked and said, we need to have a more robust, other than a series of Special Forces teams working with the Peshmerga, we need to have a conventional force on the ground that brings with it a lot more combat power. There wasn't a lot of options at the time. Now, my job in Italy, while all this was happening, I was, in the first 2 months of 2003, our battalion had jumped into Kosovo during an operation, and we were out of the country. Things were happening on the globe, and we were still accomplishing certain missions inside of Europe's foothold there that was influencing things that were happening. Once the word came down that we were being attached to the 10th Special Forces Group, things started to change very quickly. Now, at this time, we had been preparing at a brigade level to have a lot of our vehicles go by boat along with the 4th Infantry Division. The entire brigade, even though it was an airborne brigade, had 600 vehicles that we were using, and they were all being shipped out of a southern port midway through Italy called Livorno, and they were being prepared to be put on a ship. Come 2 March, all of that came to a screeching halt. My battalion, which was deployed, redeployed, and were immediately told, we're going to reshuffle how we're going to be getting into Iraq, and we're now going to go completely by air. That's where I came in and started to build these movement charts along with my brigade counterparts to show, okay, what's going to go where and on what aircraft and in what order. And kind of briefly, this kind of is a example of how I would sit down and determine who would be on what aircraft and in what order and go at what time. Imagine doing this for not only all the personnel in the brigade, around 3,000, but also 600 vehicles that you could fit up to 4 to 6 on any aircraft at any one time. We quickly realized that it was going to take a lot of airlift to move the entire brigade in a timely fashion. There were options inside of Iraq of where we were going to be able to do this. There had been options, there had been plans in country as we were preparing for Operation Iraqi Freedom of, in the event of a regime collapse, a brigade from the 82nd Airborne might jump into Baghdad International Airport and secure it. There were plans to secure smaller airfields. Many of the special operations forces were in the western desert of Iraq, and they had secured small concrete runways that were semi-capable for C-130s and smaller aircraft. There were a lot of plans on the books. The airfield in northern Iraq that we would subsequently jump on was one of those airfields that we certainly knew about. We had people in the area and on the ground. The major concern on that runway was how many landings can it sustain before it breaks apart. And I'm not an expert on the use of Iraqi concrete mixing methods, but we had people who were smart on these things, and they said it was going to break sooner than we would like it to, and it was going to require a lot of repair. Now, things like when a runway breaks because of landings and stuff rarely entered the mind of a young paratrooper as we were planning to jump in, but these were suddenly becoming very imperative. So what went in what order was a key function of what I was working with my brigade counterpart and whittling away at who really was necessary to go in first or to come in last. And that became a serious sticking point as we started to tailor the package. The other thing that kind of come up and crept up on us was this right here. Now this is a C17 Globemaster. This had been in service for about 5 to 6 years in the U.S. Air Force in 2003. There were about 90 operational C-17s, give or take on how you determine the 90. And no one, minus 3 people in the entire 173rd Airborne Brigade had ever jumped out of one, let alone even flown on one. So we were used to jumping out of a C-130, which was a prop, smaller, inter-theater, Europe, U.S. Air Force aircraft. Suddenly, we were going to be jumping into Iraq out of an airplane none of us had ever been on. So for about 6 months after, or for about 8, 9 months after I'd been in Iraq, I could say I've been on a C-17, but I've never landed in one. And about 1,000 other people were able to say the same thing. The aircraft, and this is one from the 62nd Airlift Wing, came from 4 different airlift wings, and they were all under the 62nd, and they were going to provide the package that we were going to be using going into Iraq. This aircraft was also capable of bringing in an M1 Abrams tank, and this would become key in the follow-on portion of Operation Northern Delay. As we as a brigade, light infantry, paratroopers were preparing, we had lots of things we had to go through. First and foremost was we had to build mock-ups of what this airplane even looked like so you could train the young paratroopers on how they were supposed to exit. The good thing is we were going from something that I would consider a Volkswagen up to a Cadillac Eldorado. The C-17 was spacious, comfortable, and it had every feature that you could ask for to enable someone who'd never jumped out of it to do it safely with minimal practice. We determined with the amount of aircraft we were going to be taking, about a third of the brigade was going to need to jump in to help secure the airfield, follow on operations, and then the other half were going to be bringing in all the vehicles. Those 600 vehicles that were now moving in early March, mid-March by this point, from southern Italy back to Aviano Air Base, which is in northern Italy, they all needed a driver and a second individual in the vehicle. And they had to be rigged and put on platforms that would then go in the back of the C-17s in order as we wanted to receive them on the drop zone once we commenced air land. The other thing, and this is why I have the picture up there, is the paratroopers were told, look, it's going to be a semi-permissive environment. You're going to pack as much extra stuff in your rucksacks as possible. The average weight just in the rucksack was 75 pounds. Some went up to 100. And total weight that the paratroopers were going in was somewhere around 150 to 160 extra pounds. And with soldiers that were only about 150 or 160 pounds, it was a significant amount of weight. But they were going to have to sustain themselves for several days while they were on the ground. Now myself, as an operations officer, I'm not ashamed to say I jumped in a Toughbook computer in my rucksack and was able to use that once I hit the ground, along with many other items. The last combat jump the 173rd did was in February of 1967. It was a daylight jump, similar circumstances. They were reinforcing, providing a blocking force for another force that was moving, and incidentally, it was from the 4th Infantry Division. So we have this habitual relationship going way back with the 4th Infantry Division. C-17s are what we were allotted for this operation. Now that equated to about a quarter of all the C-17s, which is the Air Force strategic lift aircraft that the Air Force had at that moment in time. So if that doesn't tell you what the priority that was put on this operation, really nothing would. 5 of the aircraft were going to drop vehicles, supplies, some heavy weapons. 10 of the aircraft were going to be dropping the paratroopers, about 100 paratroopers per aircraft. And then 2 were going to be for spares in case any one of those other aircraft broke. Now, we did have plans that as other aircraft, more than 2 broke, we had to have plans on what would be what we called bumped from one aircraft to another. And that was about as complicated of a plan as you could get. We were able to do a bump plan all the way down to 6 aircraft, and 2 heavy drops is what we said. Anything less than this was going to be not worth the effort of what we're getting ready to send in. Now, when you're getting ready to do a jump, a high visibility exercise like we were, a lot of things have to be taken into consideration, and a lot of people come out of the woodwork and want to get on this operation. General Bell, B.B. Bell, who was the USAF commander at the time, he had very strict guidance, and he personally came down and supervised several times on making sure nobody, the paratroopers have a affectionate term called strap hanger. That's anybody that tries to get on your jump that isn't part of the task organization actually needed for the jump. You could see it's not just infantry that's needed on an operation such as this. You have support groups from Air Force. Yes, Air Force has paratroopers that jump in with the infantry units, and they provide terminal guidance. They do the inspections on the runways. They help fix runways and control things. You have artillery, We had an entire medical detachment with surgeons that jumped in, and of course, members from the 10th Special Forces Group who came up as liaisons and then jumped in with us, with knowing that they were going to link back up with their units on the ground. Not everybody on this task organization jumped. Just like to point out that we had individuals from the 10th Mountain Division that were attached to our artillery, Q-36 radar personnel, which wasn't organic to the 173rd. They were attached at the last minute, came over from the States, and then they flew in on the airland. Again, about 1,000 personnel were scheduled to jump. As we were preparing, 19 March started the air war. That was the same day that I was alerted as the S-3 Air to get up to Aviano, which was almost 6 days in advance of when we planned to jump, to help organize the vehicles as they were getting on. We were putting them in serials to get onto the aircraft. 20 March, the ground war begins, so we're still preparing. Boom, the ground war is already kicked off. The threat now of Iraqi units repositioning gets very high. Task Force Viking, the Special Forces element that we were under, they conducted an operation. Remember, Turkey did not want us flying through their airspace at this point. They conducted an operation called Operation Ugly Baby. Yes, that's historical, and that's what the name was, where they were going to fly from Jordan up to the area that we were going to jump into. They got engaged along the way, and that is a picture of an MC-130, a special ops version of a C-130 prop aircraft that got all shot up. They had to do an emergency landing in Turkey, and suddenly Turkey decided, we're going to allow you to fly over and do whatever you need to through their airspace. They still were holding fast on no ground forces coming through Turkey, but aircraft could go through it, certainly if they were soft aircraft. The good thing is, because we were task organized, the 173rd Airborne Brigade, we were now soft in the eyes of movement through diplomatic channels as we were coming in. That's going to play in here in a few minutes. This simplified things for the 173rd and for our armor task force that was going to be coming in on the airland. We no longer had to fly a surreptitious route around Jordan and over other areas to get into northern Iraq. We were able to fly a fairly direct route, going to be about a 4.5-hour flight from Aviano, Italy, northern Italy, into what was going to be Bashur drop zone in northern Iraq. And again, the key was we were trying to prevent, or we were ready for that sudden collapse of the regime, and then a lot of people, a lot of other organizations, Kurdish organizations, Peshmerga organizations within the Kurdish organizations, the Turkish factions within Iraq that may try to destabilize things much greater than what we had anticipated. Bashur, Iraq, the drop zone was about 45 miles, above the green line. As you can see, the two major cities, Mosul and Kirkuk, it was not quite halfway. If you, drove to each one of them, it was about the same distance. It was within the green zone, and this is that, again, that semi-autonomous Kurdish area that the Special Operations Forces were working with the Kurds in. C-17s arrive in Aviano on or about the 22nd, 23rd. We're able to do some actual familiarization with the aircraft, mostly the key leaders. All of the troops are still back at our base in Vicenza preparing. That's all 17 lined up, took up almost the entire taxiway in Aviano. Was the most C-17s gathered at one time up to this point. On the 24th, all the brigade, 173rd and attachments are alerted. They're brought into, our base was called Caserma, Italy, and it was in Vicenza. And then late that night, we're bussed. The main body is bussed up early on the morning of the 25th. At this same time on the 25th, the brigade's long-range surveillance detachment has moved to Constanța, Romania, linked up with the 10th Special Forces, and we have now flown in a group of pathfinders that are going to assist with the landing. We start getting reports about this time. The rain and snow is coming sideways in northern Iraq. When everyone asks about Iraq, I say, I remember the mud. And people are like, well, I thought it was one big desert. Yeah, not everywhere. And it was raining sideways, and the jump was in question for weather at this point in time. Now, I'd been up at Aviano for about 5.5 days by this point. What we were doing, dusk to dawn, and many hours in between, is everything with the Air Force is about weight. A vehicle, a Humvee, would pull up. We'd put it on a platform, on a weight scale, based off of the other things that we were putting on one of those C-17s. The weight would come out to where we either had to take something off or put something on to make all the weight work. And we had crates of ammunition, we had water, we had other things so that we could balance and make a list of every single thing that would go on each vehicle. And it was mind-numbing work. We would get down to where you got 125 pounds. Okay, 2 boxes of hand grenades. How much does that weigh? Well, it weighs this much. Okay, put those there, strap them down. How about this? Until we got to the point where every vehicle was within about 100 pounds or less of the max weight that it could handle. And all that, again, was calculated through the Air Force. Young Assistant S4 named Steve Brignoli, he certainly earned a medal on that one because he was every single vehicle I think he had memorized. But the serials were then all put in order, matched up with drivers, and they were waiting in line so that once the drop happened, those aircraft would come back to Aviano and they would load up a series of vehicles or supplies, and then they would fly into Bashur drop zone. And it was going to be a continuous process for several weeks. Here you see the entire brigade preparing to move to the aircraft and don their parachutes. Now, what normally happens is they'll rig their rucksacks with their straps so that once they get their parachute, they'll hook their rucksacks and all their other equipment. It all works seamlessly. And they'll rig all that up, and they'll walk to the back of the aircraft. As you can see, you have the aircraft tails. That's where the parachutes will be waiting for the soldiers to put on. And then the jump masters, those specially trained barrel-chested freedom fighters, start doing their jump inspections to make sure everything is okay. And they'll line up in 2 rows, whether they're going out the left door or the right door. Now, the way the doors are designated is, as you look at the aircraft from the tail, that's the right door. But when you go to the right door, you're actually going out on your left. So it's a little counterintuitive, but that's how we did it, and it seemed to work. So we're all preparing. It was at this point that Colonel Mayville, the 173rd Brigade Commander, talked to everybody, said what was happening. We got a weather report, so it was a little iffy for a little while. The following morning is when the final weather report came in. And much like if you're familiar with the D-Day landings, we got the updates that there was going to be a little window of clear skies at around between 2000 local, 8 p.m. and midnight local. Now, Iraq is only a 1-hour difference, so that made it pretty easy. So we had a window where we were able to get in, and that's what we went for. So the weather call was made. Everything was good. We had our last meal. I'm not sure what it was. I'm sure it was steak and crab legs. That's what it always is. And then at 1600, 4 p.m. local in Vicenza, under a cloudless, beautiful Italian day, we all loaded up on our aircraft and moved in. I was on Chalk 8, right door number 2. I was right behind my battalion operations officer, especially since I had the tough book that had all of our information on it. Interestingly enough as well, if you're familiar with the new Army ID card system, the CAC card, Combined Access Card, that was pretty new in 2003. The Air Force was doing a digital scanning to create the manifest, which was going to say who was on every aircraft. Now, the manifest is a big deal. Number one, that lets the commander know where all his troopers are at, because each aircraft will not have just one unit. You cross-load individuals on all 10 aircraft. So my battalion, the 2nd of the 503rd, had personnel on every single aircraft out of the 10 aircraft. So we needed to make sure where it was all at. Well, the Air Force, they thought, well, we'll just do a digital manifest and it'll all be digital. I knew that was probably problematic, and so I asked for a hard copy, and one of the brigade NCOs, Rebecca Sport, she pulled up and got me a hard copy, and so I shoved it into my uniform, that uniform right there at the last minute, and jumped in a hard copy, and sure enough, about 6 months later, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, do you think we could find a manifest anywhere? No, except for that hard copy that I had, and that's actually in the 173rd Museum in Italy right now. So technology, and I'm a historian of technology, it's not always your friend. You know, there are pitfalls, but so that's what we were doing. I was on Chalk 8, roughly 1,700 local. Now this is the other thing. There's not a lot of these plans that remained. Highly classified, they were gone. We didn't take anything with us. I have some notes. I tried to bounce it off. Memory's a little faulty with some people. My notes said 1,700 local takeoff, 1,600 4 p.m. You had an hour to load. Once you were loaded, then the Air Force takes over and it's out of your hands. And we started taking off at that time. So Chalk 8 would have been well down the line to take off because there were 5 C-17s first. They were carrying heavy stuff. And then, 1, 2, 3, so we were probably 20 or so minutes back from when the original aircraft took off. As you can see, they were taking off in, it's still a couple of minutes. About an hour into the flight, I got up and looked out the right side, one of the right side windows, and could see support aircraft, F-18s from the fleet in the Mediterranean. We had a B-52 that was flying somewhere in front that was doing electronic things. There were, dozens of squadrons of support aircraft that were preventing anything from happening to the flight. On board, this is what it looks like. You have 4 rows of 25 individuals each inside the aircraft. The jump masters, those that are in charge, they're up front. They're going to put everybody out, then they're going to be the last ones out of the aircraft to make sure everybody gets out. You see it's really pretty spacious. So for an old paratrooper who's been on some very crowded aircraft, C-130s and C-141s, it was a pleasant surprise, probably a little too pleasant for what we were getting ready to get into. It led to a false sense of security. We were scheduled to drop at 2300, which is 11 o'clock at night, in Iraq, which is 1 hour different from Italy. The 5 aircraft in front were going to drop all their heavy equipment and stuff out the back of the aircraft with big parachutes, and they were going to be 3 minutes in front of all the personnel aircraft. There were 5 personnel aircraft, then there was about a 2-minute distance between the other 5. The C-17 really churns up the air. And so the aircraft fly and they stagger and then one's behind the other. So they don't necessarily fly right behind each other. There's some staggering that goes with it. And that's to avoid a lot of the turbulence. So once the paratroopers exit, they're not caught in this huge, vacuum that throws them all around. The descent was going to be brutal. We got told that right up from the front. The drop zone was in a valley. I'm going to show you pictures. It was real steep on each side. We were going to drop into a valley, and then the aircraft were going to have to exit quickly from the valley. Normally, you drop at about, 1,000 feet per minute to get to drop altitude. we were going to have to do approximately 4,000 feet drop per minute. And I'm going to show you a video in a second that you can kind of see, as you know, the angle that the soldiers, the weight, you know, now you're talking G-forces as the aircraft come down much faster than you're used to. Luckily, my rucksack was so big, all I did was kind of put my knees on it, and it held me up pretty good. Normally, it would be a little bit smaller. But a lot of the paratroopers to this day say the descent was just crushing. There's going to be 58 seconds of green light. The doors, when the light goes from red to green, indicating to jump, you got 58 seconds. And we're going to drop everybody in one pass. That's a difference from the jump in Vietnam where they did multiple passes. This was the largest drop since Korean War era where we did it all in one pass. Very quick descent into the valley starting at about 600 feet, and the aircraft would rise a little bit from that, and then a very steep egress as they're getting out of there. So anybody that didn't make it out, the doors went down and they weren't making it out. I have a little video here to kind of show you. This was the only official video that came out the day or so after the drop. Okay, if you're unfamiliar with regular paratroopers jump static line, the line is hooked to a cable, and as you exit, it pulls your parachute out. You don't have to do anything. The individual you saw, he is trying to control the static line so one man behind the other one doesn't accidentally loop his hand in somebody else's static lines or they get out of control. He's called the safety. And at the end there, you saw he was looking out the aircraft to make sure nobody's being towed, which happens occasionally for whatever reason. A paratrooper, it may not activate, and he's suddenly towed by that static line. So he clears, makes sure it's good, then he comes back in, they yank in all the little static lines are attached to a little bag, and then they proceed on very quickly. That was the official, what was put out after the jump went. 20 soldiers were hurt on landing, which was a relatively low number comparatively to what was happening. That was probably because the drop zone was mostly mud, and when you landed, you just stuck into mud up to your waist. And about 30 soldiers did not make it out of the aircraft in time, which means the red light came on and the aircraft started to egress out of the drop zone before they could get out, and the Air Force took over, shut the doors. Those soldiers then flew back to Aviano and then had to come in on an airland a day or two later. Now this was a painting we had several months after we were in Iraq. We had a local artist in Kirkuk, Iraq. We paid him to make some paintings. So this is one of the first ones. And after we're done, you can take a look at, he did some smaller ones. He probably made a small fortune. We thought the C-17s looked a little distorted, but what can you expect? You know, local work. The entire operation took 25 minutes. From the first aircraft dropping to the last one out, 25 minutes in and done. This is one of the reasons it was done this way. Landing all those paratroopers, offloading, doing other things would have taken a lot more time in a couple of days. This is what the drop zone looked like on the map. I have my map up here if you want to take a look at it. It's a printed map. It's not even actually a real geospatial map. You could see the big black little thing in the middle looks like a sword, a medieval sword. That's the runway. The runway, 6,000 feet. The drop zone was actually about 10 kilometers long, 58 seconds, roughly 10 kilometers long. So you had paratroopers scattered over 10 kilometers. But they landed in the groups because depending on where you exited in an aircraft, let's say on Chalk 2, your counterparts on Chalk 4 were exiting about the same time over that space. So it worked out pretty well. One infantry battalion protected the south, one infantry battalion the north, with everybody else in the middle. As you can see, the direction of flight was from the north. Now, the runway itself was a cause of concern. These aren't, good old Kansas-built, concrete runways. There was a lot of problems that had to be dealt with after every landing. The other thing you have to take into consideration with air operations is how many aircraft can you land at one time that can be on the ground, what we call the mission on the ground, or the MOG. The maximum was 4 aircraft. Now, the Air Force didn't want to put 4 C-17s on an austere runway at one time in case one breaks. Then you got problems, so you got to have air crews, mechanics. There's many things that go into this that are above and beyond just jumping out of a plane. The throughput, because we're only landing under periods of darkness, was 15 airplanes a day into that drop zone. So now you're talking what comes in and when. And the Air Force, who are the unsung heroes of this whole thing, they kept an operational readiness rate of almost 100% for their aircraft, those 17 that we were using for the next several weeks. So every night, 15 airplanes landed, offloaded, and then we did the same thing. Starting the second day, all the vehicles, artillery, all these other things start to flow into the drop zone. By March 27th, we were securing it. You could see these are the Bashur Airfield is down in that valley. We were putting soldiers up on the high ground, securing it. This freed the Special Operations Forces, who had to secure the drop zone, the runway before, to go out with their Kurdish counterparts and go after the enemy. This was key to what was going to happen next. Follow-on operations started in earnest on the 28th. 48 hours after the drop, Special Forces teams who were relieved from guarding the airfield, the Air Force isn't going to land these really expensive airplanes with 5 people guarding it. They need a brigade to guard and prevent anybody from coming after it. Operation Viking Hammer commenced. The Special Forces teams were able to go fix and start to attrit the remaining Iraqi divisions. Our biggest concern after about a couple of days was carrying fuel by air into Bashur. This was, as the planners looked at, said this was going to be untenable, even with just the amount of fuel a light infantry brigade and the Special Forces needed. Flying in fuel was a bad idea. So diplomatic efforts were able to get Turkey to allow fuel to be moved in through one of the lines of communication, a place called Harbor Gate, which was north of Bashur. We started to contract to bring fuel in. That alleviated a lot of anxiety about flying in fuel on C-17s. By the 31st of March, the entire 173rd Airborne Brigade is on the ground. We have 400 vehicles that we need, and we're going to contract for everything else we need. By the 7th of April, Task Force 163 Armor under Operation Dragon commences. Operation Dragon is the introduction of M1 Abrams and Bradley fighting vehicles in a combined task force. Now is going to fly from Germany, from the 1st Infantry Division, into Bashur and have an armored fist in that part of northern Iraq ready for combat operations. 5 M1 Abrams, 5 Bradleys, 10 APCs, a whole host of mortars, scouts, other vehicles, even a military police detachment is flown in as part of Task Force 163. Now, interestingly, this is not the first introduction of M1s by a C-17 into the war. Task Force 20, which was a special operations task force in the western desert of Iraq, flew in 10 M1 Abrams tanks to an austere airfield to do operations against the Iraqis, and those tanks were from the 3rd ID. But this was the first complete task force that flew in by C-17 into a combat zone. And those are actual pictures of Task Force 163 coming in. 10 April, 173rd Airborne Brigade is ordered to commence the attack on Kirkuk. The Iraqi lines are starting to crumble, and we're to go in and capture Kirkuk, prevent it from falling to sectarian violence, and secure that area and start conducting follow-on operations. This is the big movement. The period of time in between, we were building up forces, building up supplies, conducting some small raids, but securing that airfield for this operation, again, while the soft element can do what they're good at, and that's go out in small groups and hunt the enemy. Okay, this, you know, as a historian, and especially as my colleagues know, a historian that collects military uniforms and things, I made a big mistake myself. This was the uniform that I jumped into Iraq in. And this is that same uniform. We did not have the fancy tan-colored patches at the time, and of course, just like all soldiers, once those fancy tan-colored patches came out, I was enamored with them and cut off all my historical patches that I had jumped into Iraq with and sewed the new ones on. But I did have the wherewithal to keep those old patches. You know, kind of bothers me to this day, but you know, I still have it, and it was nice. So we get, you know, the shiny object, the nice tan patches look good, but you know, I realized, geez. Now you got to realize as well, we only had 2 uniforms, so it wasn't like I could just roll one up and stick it somewhere for a while. I'm surprised that the smell came out of it as much as it did. By mid-April, the 4th ID is now on the ground. They've moved up. They've arrived in the Tikrit area, and the 173rd is then placed under the 4th Infantry Division. So we remain under the 4th Infantry Division from roughly mid-April until late February, beginning of April, or beginning of March, when the 173rd is relieved and heads back to Europe. Northern delay demonstrated the integration of airborne forces and SOF, and it showed that conventional and special operations forces should work together jointly to accomplish these missions. And it showed that an airborne force demonstrates the flexibility to go where and when needed. A lot of this debate about, you know, mobility and is this still practical anymore is just, in my mind, kind of ludicrous at this point. It's been proven over and over. And with that, before I start, we'll turn the mics on. I'll take some questions. We get the
What was your aircraft speed at the time of drop?
I'm sorry, what was that?
How fast was the plane flying when you jumped out?
120 knots, you know, around 120 knots. I personally think they were going faster, but that's just... The interesting thing about the C-17 is there's a built-in, and this is why I have this is a Jim Stovall print that he made for us. He had the print, but he put the patches on it. One of the interesting things you can see is the C-17 has built-in platforms that are kind of big that you essentially, as you exit the aircraft, you walk out onto a platform outside of the aircraft, and then you kind of walk off at an angle, which makes it very simple, but a lot of soldiers weren't used to that. They were used to kind of jumping out of the aircraft, and there are other videos out there that show soldiers stumbling and stuff. It had nothing to do with the speed. It was just no practice in the C-17.
Hey, Dirk, just a question about the outload support that was provided to 173rd at Aviano. Who drew the ammunition? Did you have another unit that came in from somewhere else in Europe to do all that and allow your troops to do the rehearsals and receive the operations orders and do planning and things like that? Or
Yes.
did you task organize within the brigade?
The good thing, especially when BB Bell came down, USARA, which is U.S. Army Europe, that command had it under their purview to help us, and they brought people down, and it really enabled us to not need to do a lot of, I didn't have to go to ammo holding area. It showed up, elements from Europe came to Italy, part of the Army elements, and their sole job there was to help outload the brigade so we can have everybody prepared to go into theater. And that was a big one. The other part of that was, even once the operation started, USARA, U.S. Army Europe, took the responsibility to supply all of northern Iraq. They brought that under their purview. Even with the soft forces, they were going to be the conduit to make sure the northern front was taken care of, essentially. And it worked pretty well. Once we went to Kirkuk had another big airfield. We fixed it up, and that became one of the major hubs. Bashur drop zone, where we jumped in, was shut down, and things were moved to Kirkuk, which was a bigger, a little more robust airfield. Because Bashur started to crumble several weeks, or several days into it. There had to be constant maintenance on the airfield to keep it, as those C-17s landed, it started to crumble, and so they had to continually maintain it. Tom?
I enjoyed your presentation very much. My question is, after you personally hit the ground at Bashur, jumping from the C-17, did you continue to have elaborate organizational responsibilities after you hit the ground? You described these incredibly intricate things for the loading. Did that go on in some form after the landing?
Oh, yeah. So after I, and don't tell nobody, cut a little piece of my parachute off, because that's what paratroopers do, and I put a piece of parachute into my pocket for posterity, made it to the assembly area. It was all about accountability. So the first 24 hours, you're just making sure everybody showed up. The ones that are hurt, you're tracking them at the battalion level, talking with the companies, and then reporting to brigade. And then as soon as that ended, it was tracking all the vehicles that were coming in. We expanded the airhead, putting in security, bringing in wire, digging positions, and then preparing. Probably within a week, we really transitioned everything to preparing for the assault down to Kirkuk. We knew that's where we were going to go, and as the Iraqis started to crumble, we knew it was going to happen pretty quick. And how to move, going from air, then to ground, how do you marshal everybody and get them from point A to point B? We actually contracted flatbed semi-trailers, like you see, just a big semi-truck with a trailer, and lined it with paratroopers sitting on the back, and that's how many of them rode into Kirkuk. Some of them said it was the best ride they ever had, because the alternative would have been walking, and we weren't going to be walking. But so yes, everything, it's continuous planning. If it's not this, it's accountability, and then we're going to be, okay, now we're going to assault Kirkuk. How are we going to organize? Who's the main effort? Who's here? How are we going to marshal these vehicles? There was a myriad of things that kept happening. The year went pretty quick for me, it seems like. Anything else? I want to make sure to put up here the next lecture. Dr. John Hostler will be presenting Thursday, October 5th.